In the late 1970s, the world really felt like it was coming apart at the seams. I once talked with this retired factory worker, and he remembered those days so vividly, not for the big headlines, but for the smell of the picket lines and the lights flickering in his neighborhood because they couldn't even keep the power on consistently. And back then, when you had figures like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan step onto the stage, they didn't just sound like politicians.
No, they sounded like something new.
They sounded like liberators. They had this simple, almost elegant promise: the market will set you free. And this guy I knew, my neighbor, he was all in.
He bought it completely.
Oh, completely. He cheered when Reagan lowered his taxes. He was beaming when Thatcher told him he could finally buy the council house he'd lived in for decades.
Yeah.
He felt, I think for the first time, like he was actually the pilot of his own life. I remember him saying, "We're finally getting what we deserve." He was just convinced that the so-called sick man of Europe was getting the medicine it needed.
So that invisible hand of the market wasn't just an economic theory to him.
No, it was a rescue mission. But then, the atmosphere. It started to shift in a way he didn't really have the words for.
It wasn't a big bang.
No, not a sudden crash. It was this quiet, almost clinical dismantling. The factory where he'd worked for 30 years.
Yeah.
It wasn't just modernized, it was gutted. The coal mines in town didn't just close, they were crushed. And that house he was so proud to own. Decades later, his own kids couldn't afford to live on the same street. The freedom he'd celebrated had turned into, well, a landlord's paradise.
It makes you wonder.
It really does. Was the economic panic of the 70s this fever that just had to break naturally? Or was it the perfect excuse for a very specific, very deliberate kind of coup? We were told government was the problem, the market was the cure. But when you look back at the wreckage of the middle class and the rise of this new, untouchable billionaire class, you have to ask, who was the market actually liberating? And who did it leave behind in the debris of a freedom they just couldn't afford anymore?
That story, that opening, it really frames our mission for this deep dive perfectly. Because that worker's story, his initial hope, and then the quiet collapse of his entire world, that's the core narrative of the last 40 years, really, across the whole industrialized world. We're going to be digging into the structural and the cultural changes that happened when this global economic pivot promised individual freedom.
But delivered collective wreckage.
Exactly.
That's the story.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because what you're describing, it isn't just a recession. It feels like a fundamental change in the moral structure of society.
Precisely. We need to look at three things that are all connected. First, the structural pivot from industrial stability to financial speculation. That's the machine that gutted that factory, the how. Second, the cultural impact, the way market fundamentalism affected the family and led to the rise of what some call the therapeutic state, the search for new social glue.
And the third piece, the ideology, the story we told ourselves to justify it all, the tyranny of meritocracy. That's what created this modern sense of elite betrayal. We're basically charting the course from an economy that valued the dignity of labor, of making things, to one that just valorized paper profits and, well, speculation.
Let's start with the money then. If we're moving away from the factor that employed my neighbor, what actually took its place? The material we've looked at points right to the rise of the FIRE sector. What is that exactly?
FIRE is an acronym. It stands for finance, insurance, and real estate.
Okay.
And it's really the shorthand for this huge structural shift in how wealth is generated. Historically, wealth came from industry, from building things, from the labor that went into it.
Tangible stuff.
Tangible stuff. Today, wealth is overwhelmingly driven by capital gains, by financial engineering, by manipulating existing assets. And of those three letters in FIRE, real estate is the undisputed champion. It's the largest asset category in every major economy.
And there's a crucial statistic about this, right? About how concentrated it is.
It's just astounding. In the US, in Britain, in Australia, all key economies that really leaned into this pivot, real estate mortgages make up about 70% of all bank loans.
70%.
Think about that. The vast majority of what the banking sector does, its biggest customer, is the real estate market. The entire financial system is basically hinged on one thing: rising property values and people's ability to take on more and more debt to buy those properties.
70%. That sounds less like a balanced economy and more like a A huge monolithic bet on a single asset class. And that didn't just happen by accident, right? It had to be encouraged.
It was absolutely encouraged, or maybe catalyzed is a better word. It was catalyzed by these fundamental policy decisions that just tilted the entire economic playing field. You have to ask, why does capital flow where it flows? And the answer is always incentives. We have to look at what drew the money out of the factory and into, the empty lot next door.
So let's play that out. Why would an investor with a huge pile of cash choose not to build a factory?
Well, building a factory, that takes years of organization. You need physical infrastructure, you need labor, you have to navigate markets, supply chains. It's complicated. And then if you actually succeed and make a profit, that profit is usually taxed at the corporate rate, which is often around 30%.
Okay, so that's option A. Complicated, risky, taxed at 30%. What's option B?
Option B, which became the dominant option, is this. Buy a piece of land or an existing building, and then you just hold on to it. You wait for its value to go up.
And the tax incentive there is the kicker.
It's the whole game. The sources are brutally clear on this. Capital gains, the profit you make just from selling something that's gone up in value, are taxed at only half the rate of wages and industrial profits.
Yeah.
Just think about that single policy difference. A 50% discount on tax for passive speculation versus active production. It created this irresistible magnet for capital. Since the late 1960s, the annual rise in land prices has consistently beaten the growth in national income.
So if you can make more money with less risk and pay half the tax,
why on earth would you bother with the messy, risky business of actually making something? You wouldn't.
Wait, okay, let me just make sure I have this straight. So you're saying if my neighbor, the factory worker, earns $50,000 on the assembly line, that whole 50 grand is taxed at one rate?
Yes, the full income rate.
But if an investor buys a painting or piece of land and sells it a year later for a $50,000 profit, that profit is taxed at basically half the rate.
That is the structural reality we've built. The system is designed from the ground up to reward the passive collection of rents and asset appreciation over the active generation of income through labor or production.
And that's the force that hollowed out those towns.
It's the driving force. The reliable, productive jobs vanished because the fastest, lowest tax, highest reward path to wealth creation completely shifted away from production.
And this structural shift, this is what leads into what the material calls the bubble economy and debt peonage. It sounds like the whole system depends on things just always getting more expensive.
That's the operating principle. The bubble economy is all about using debt, leveraging yourself in this relentless search for capital gains. The whole thing hinges on one massive bet.
Which is?
That asset prices will always rise faster than the interest on the debt you took out to buy them.
Before this system really took hold, how did people even figure out what a piece of property was worth?
The traditional model was actually quite elegant. The price of a property was just the annual rent it could generate, divided by the prevailing interest rate. P equals R over I.
So if a building brings in, say, $10,000 in rent a year, and the interest rate is 10%.
The property was valued at $100,000. Simple as that.
And if the interest rate gets cut in half, to 5%.
Then the denominator shrinks, and the price of that same building immediately doubles to $200,000, even if the rent hasn't changed by a single penny.
So low interest rates create massive asset bubbles.
They do, but modern finance, especially since the 80s, has gone way beyond even that model. It's not just about the income a property can generate anymore.
Oh, so?
Today's post-industrial reality is, it's regressing. The sources use the term debt peonage. Buyers, like the children of that factory worker, aren't buying a house because their wages can comfortably cover the mortgage.
They're buying it because they're betting on the market.
They're betting on the market. They plan to pay off their debt or just keep refinancing it as the asset price inflates around them. The whole hope is that the rising value of the house outstrips the crushing weight of the debt.
So you're not banking on your salary anymore. You're banking on speculation. You're buying a high-stakes lottery ticket that you have to win.
And this became the central mechanism for sustaining the illusion of middle-class life, even as wages were stagnating.
How does that work?
Well, the factory workers' wages stopped keeping up with the cost of housing, education, healthcare. So how did families keep up their standard of living? They started using home equity loans.
So they were spending the wealth from their appreciating house.
They were monetizing the rising collateral value of their home to pay for the lifestyle their flat wages couldn't support anymore. They were literally paying the banks with the rising value of their house, not with newly earned income.
Like a perpetual motion machine that only works if it never, ever slows down.
Exactly. And if asset prices flatten or, God forbid, decline, if the bubble bursts,
The family is left with a debt that's way bigger than the asset is worth. Widespread financial catastrophe.
it creates a generation that's just constantly indebted, always chasing the curve, unable to achieve real financial stability through work alone.
This sounds inherently political, and that brings us to the unearned increment and fiscal favoritism. The tax code didn't just incentivize this. It seems like it actively subsidized it.
It absolutely did. And the real estate sector in particular successfully lobbied to turn one specific accounting loophole into the single biggest tax shelter in the modern economy.
And what is that loophole?
It's called the depreciation allowance. And this is where it becomes a kind of fiction.
What's the fiction?
The fiction is that buildings are depreciating, that they're losing book value, even while their actual market price is soaring because of the rising value of the land underneath them.
So the market says your building is getting more and more valuable, but the IRS lets you pretend it's falling apart for tax purposes.
That is precisely the fiscal favoritism at play. Landlords use these fictional tax write-offs to shelter their rental income from taxation. It is not at all uncommon for major property investors to declare no net taxable income.
Zero.
Because on paper, their accounting shows these massive depreciation losses.
That is just astonishing. And the sources say you can do this over and over.
Again and again, buildings can be written off again and again. When one owner has fully depreciated the asset, they sell it, they realize those capital gains, which are taxed at that lower rate, remember, and the new owner just starts the whole depreciation cycle over again.
So it's an accounting deception that means investors are enjoying soaring returns and paying out dividends while telling the taxman they're constantly losing money.
That's the system.
The contrast here is just so stark, it brings me back to my neighbor. He pays the full income rate on every single dollar he earns, making something real.
Something tangible.
Meanwhile, the property speculator who buys the house next door uses accounting magic to legally erase his taxable income, even as his net worth is exploding thanks to the rising land value. The unearned increment.
And the high-level consequence of this is what the sources call a massive redistribution of the tax burden. This favoritism shifts the responsibility for funding society onto consumers, onto labor income. It just pours fuel on the fire of wealth polarization.
So it completely contradicts the whole idea of a progressive tax system.
It makes a mockery of it. The tax code effectively declares, through policy, that the factory worker's effort is fiscally less desirable than the speculator's passivity.
That structural picture is, well, it's pretty damning.
Yeah.
And it connects to this really charged public debate we always have about the idea that the West has just stopped making things. So let's reframe the decline of manufacturing. What does the data actually show?
Right. This narrative that the West, the US, Germany, and so on, has just stopped making things is, it's a major oversimplification.
So it's not true.
It's not that simple. In reality, manufacturing output in a country like the US has actually continued to grow, and in many cases, substantially. The shift isn't in what we produce, but in how many people it takes to produce it.
So we're making more stuff than ever, but with far fewer people. This is the automation story.
Exactly. It's the result of these radical efficiency gains, from computers, from robotics. The move to a service economy is really a byproduct of that success. We shifted not because we decided to stop producing, but because automation got so good that theoretically a tiny percentage of the population, say 5%, can make all the physical goods needed for 100% of the people.
Which allows the other 95% of the workforce to move into services. Healthcare, education, software.
Finance, and so on. Yes. So the real anxiety isn't about our capacity to produce. It's about our capacity to provide dignified, stable jobs for everyone whose labor isn't needed by the automated factory anymore.
And it's important to see where global power still lies in this new landscape.
Crucial. The US, for instance, still dominates in these really critical areas. We're talking about high-tech manufacturing tools, the incredibly complex, precise machines you need to, say, fabricate semiconductors.
The machines that make the machine.
Exactly. And we also dominate critical service exports. Intellectual property, software, telecommunications, financial services.
And those are the high-value things that are often invisible in the public debate, which is all about, imported sneakers and toys.
Precisely. When you hear someone complain that America doesn't make anything anymore, they're overlooking the immense value of that IP, of those high-tech tools. We might rely on others for the final assembly, but the chip designs and the machines that make the chips are often developed and exported from here.
This reframing seems essential because it changes how you think about the risks of global trade. If we are still dominant in these high-value areas, what does that mean for geopolitical stability? The old argument is that interdependence makes conflict impossible.
Well, the sources lay out a really compelling argument that today's complex supply chains do promote stability, but through a kind of mutual destruction if those trade ties are cut. And the key insight is understanding the different impact of a trade cut on an export-heavy country versus an import-heavy customer country.
Walk us through that. Who gets hurt more?
The export-heavy country, the one whose entire economic model is based on selling its goods abroad. They suffer far more immediate and destructive harm if that trade is cut off. Their whole foundation is based on that foreign demand.
So let's take a hypothetical.
Okay, take a major exporting nation where, say, 16% of all its exports go to one big customer, like the U.S.
Right.
If that customer suddenly cuts off all trade, the consequences for the exporting nation are immediate and systemic. Their key industries just collapse. You get massive unemployment, literally overnight. And the country loses the stream of foreign currency it needs to function, to pay for food, energy, everything.
An economic chokehold.
Instantly.
Yeah.
Now, what's the cost for the customer country that was doing the importing?
They must feel it too.
They feel it, but in a different way. For the import-heavy country, cutting imports means disruption, for sure. You get temporary shortages, you have to scramble for new suppliers, or, more expensively, rebuild your own production capacity. You get inflation.
But not collapse.
But there is, as the sources say, no destruction there. Their workforce is largely intact, their underlying economic structure is sound, they suffer inconvenience and higher prices, but not a systemic collapse.
That's a huge distinction. The pain is radically asymmetrical.
Absolutely. The money loss for the exporter, who sees their industries go idle and their currency reserves vanish, is argued to be 10 times more destructive than the product loss for the importer.
The importer loses a convenience, the exporter loses their livelihood.
And potentially their internal stability. This gives the import-heavy customer a huge amount of leverage because the seller needs to sell far more desperately than the customer needs to buy.
Which creates a massive disincentive for those export-dependent nations to get into any kind of major conflict with their main customers.
It acts as a powerful deterrent, maybe even stronger than military threats alone. That economic integration has been a key factor in maintaining a kind of precarious geopolitical stability for decades.
Okay, so we have this structural economy that's tilted towards speculation and away from stable work. Wages flatten, housing costs go through the roof, and that old social promise of work just disappears. What happens to the people living inside that system? This brings us to the cultural consequences, and specifically the work of Christopher Lasch on the crisis of maturity.
This is where we get into the cultural wreckage. And Lasch's core idea is often misread. People think he was just complaining that people are selfish.
But it's deeper than that.
It's much deeper. For Lasch, narcissism isn't just selfishness. It's a profound failure to mature beyond what he called primary narcissism, the state of the infant.
And what defines that infant state?
It's the infant's longing for what he called absolute equilibrium. That psychological state where every need is instantly and perfectly met. He called it the oceanic contentment of the womb. The baby feels like it's the source of all its own gratification.
And birth is the ultimate reality check.
It is. Birth shatters that fantasy. It forces the infant to confront its own helpless dependency. So maturity, in Lasch's view, is that painful, necessary process of accepting your dependence on people who are separate from you, who will not submit to your whims.
You have to accept that the world doesn't revolve around you.
But the conditions of modern life seem to work against that process.
How so?
Well, modern society, especially after industrial stability crumbled, has prolonged the experience of helplessness and dependence deep into adulthood. Financial dependence, educational dependence, reliance on experts. This actively encourages milder forms of that primary narcissism to hang around. And so the adult develops narcissism as a psychological defense against those feelings of helpless dependency.
So the big ego, the belief that I'm special and I don't need anyone, is actually a shield against the fear of being helpless.
Exactly. It's countered by a blind optimism and these grandiose illusions of self-sufficiency. Because the world feels so unreliable, the individual retreats into a kind of psychological bubble where they feel special and powerful.
But it's a fragile power.
Very. It needs constant external validation. They need an admiring audience to prop up their self-esteem, turning the whole social world into a mirror.
And this psychological isolation was happening at the same time as the dismantling of our social glue, especially the family.
The family unit was, for centuries, the chief agency of socialization. It's where you learned morals, character, practical skills. But as work became more specialized, a father working in a complex factory can't just pass that skill to his son. That communal transfer broke down.
Right. A farmer can teach his child to farm. An accountant can't really teach their child to be an accountant in the same way.
And that vacuum was quickly filled by these new bureaucracies, the helping professions, educators, psychiatrists, social workers. They stepped in and, as the sources note, they appropriated parental functions.
And they justified this by saying they were the experts.
They used the analogy of preventive medicine. They were the specialized doctors needed to manage a sick society. And often, the family was seen as an obstacle to this social progress, which justified the continuing expansion of health, education, and welfare services.
So the individual, cut off from traditional skills, starts to surrender their autonomy to the state and these institutions.
Which feeds right back into that psychological dependence, that narcissism. When you lose real autonomy, you start searching for admiration as a substitute.
So we have this structural failure and this cultural drift towards anxious individualism. The sources identify 4 main ways people try to cope with this cultural wreckage: the despair, the loneliness, the shame.
These are the survival strategies. The first one is the striver.
A self-help crowd.
Exactly. They participate in wellness culture. They adopt the language of optimization jogging, self-improvement, mindfulness, as a way to adapt their own psyche to the system's harsh demands. The goal isn't to change the system, it's to make yourself resilient enough to survive it.
Manage your internals because the externals feel impossible.
Right. The second group is the innovators. They look at the breakdown and say, we need to build something new. They seek or create these community-centered arrangements, co-ops, mutual aid groups, new spiritual communities. Their innovation is actively building alternative social orders to satisfy that deep need for connection.
And then you have the more despair-driven responses, the dropouts.
The dropouts engage in this profound, despair-driven withdrawal. They check out of the competitive game.
So this is people leaving the workforce.
Yes, but it also manifests in the explosion of private entertainment, binge-watching, immersive gaming, retreating into virtual worlds that give you a sense of control. And tragically, it also shows up in substance abuse, particularly with opioids, which some analyses suggest provide a false but powerful sense of connection and safety that the real world lacks.
The system offered freedom, and they took the ultimate freedom to just not participate.
And finally, you have the rebels. They channel that despair and rage outwards. They find community and agency through rebellious politics, which is often this potent mix of joy and rage. They reject the whole established order, the experts, the elites, and they find solidarity in challenging the system that failed them.
This brings us right to the rise of therapeutic language in public life. Critics often say that therapy just individualizes problems, makes them your fault instead of society's. But the material suggests it's more complicated with trauma talk.
It's a huge paradox. Because while therapy does focus on the individual, the concept of trauma became the very mechanism that allowed what was once private, hidden pain to become public and therefore political.
How did that happen?
It was really catalyzed by activism in the 1970s, the women's liberation movement, and Vietnam veterans in particular, who were demanding recognition for psychological wounds.
So what was the big conceptual breakthrough?
It was moving away from the old idea of trauma as just a temporary shock, a self-healing wound. The new understanding was that these incredibly stressful experiences could be long-lasting, that they could have profound negative impacts on a person for their entire life, totally distinct from a physical injury. Recognizing that psychological harm is real and persistent was the key.
And that gave justice movements a language to demand change.
It gave them a powerful, legitimate lexicon. Trauma talk provided this medicalized language to describe the ongoing impact of abuse, making it impossible for institutions to just dismiss it as weakness. You see it in all these public inquiries now, which rely on victim testimony. It's about making private pain public as a force for reform.
So in a way, therapeutic culture, by encouraging people to speak out, actually challenges those traditional abusive authority structures.
It acts as this unintentional counterweight to the very system that created all the isolation in the first place. The reliance on experts that fueled the narcissism is now being turned back on those same institutions to demand justice.
So we've charted the structural tilt to finance, the cultural drift to dependence. Now we get to the final piece. The ideology that justifies the winners and blames the losers.
Yeah.
The tyranny of merit. Meritocracy, I mean, it sounds like the fairest system possible, right? Rewarding talent and effort. Why is it a tyranny?
Because today, meritocracy functions not as an engine for equality, but as the primary moral justification for massive structural inequality. It tells the winners that they are morally deserving of their success, and this is the really corrosive part. It tells everyone who's struggling that their fate is also deserved, because they just didn't work hard enough or they weren't smart enough.
Okay, the philosophical case against this is it's dense, but it's crucial. Let's really slow down and unpack the three main objections to merit. What's the first one?
The first one is pretty straightforward, the luck of talent. The argument is that having successful talents is just a matter of luck. It's not a moral achievement you earned. Even if you created a perfectly fair society where everyone starts at the same line, the people who are naturally gifted runners are still going to win the race. We can celebrate their speed, but we can't say they morally deserve the huge rewards that come with it because they didn't choose their genes.
It's just the randomness of the genetic lottery. But the winners always say, well, it's not just the gift, it's the hard work I put in.
And that brings us to the second, deeper objection, the luck of market demand. This one challenges the idea that even hard work deserves these massive rewards. It says that the value of your talent is completely arbitrary. It's contingent on the time and place you happen to live.
Can you give us the classic example of that?
The best one is LeBron James. He has incredible talent, and he's worked incredibly hard. But his skills bring in generational wealth because he lives in the 21st century, in a society that pays billions of dollars for sports entertainment. Now, imagine if LeBron James had been born during the Italian Renaissance. His specific athletic skills wouldn't have been valued in the same way. Back then, society prized fresco painters and sculptors.
So he's lucky not just for his talent, but because his talent happens to be what society values most right now.
Precisely. His success is contingent on what society happens to want. The market isn't rewarding pure merit or pure effort, it's rewarding contingency. And that insight just fundamentally undercuts the moral claim of people who believe they earned every penny they have.
Because the value of every penny was defined by luck and social context. That changes everything. It means the winners aren't just better, they just drew a better hand in the societal lottery.
What's the third and maybe most socially damaging objection?
That is meritocratic hubris. This is what happens when people believe the first two objections don't matter. The successful, having, inhaled too deeply of their own success, come to believe they morally deserve their wealth and their power, and this hubris breeds contempt for the less successful. It's that attitude of, they just didn't work hard enough.
Then what does that do to the people who don't rise?
It inflicts this profound demoralization. If the system tells you success is all about talent and effort, and you're still failing, the only conclusion you can draw is that your failure is your own fault, that you're inadequate. It makes the economic divide a moral one.
And this philosophy didn't stay in the classroom. It entered politics through what the sources call the rhetoric of rising. You heard this all the time from elites in the 90s and 2000s. Absolutely. The defining political message of that whole era was slogans like Bill Clinton's, "What you earn depends on what you learn." This constant emphasis on a college degree as the only path to a good life. The whole political project shifted away from fixing structural problems like stagnant wages or outsourcing, and instead offered the individual a workaround. Climb out of your situation with a credential.
So the solution to a broken system was, just get a college degree and you'll be fine. Leave your community behind.
That was the unspoken contract. And the insult in that is so profound. It implies that if you're struggling without a college degree, it's your own fault. It's a personal deficit of ambition or effort. It shifts the blame for systemic inequality onto the individual.
And this created the massive diploma divide that defines our politics today.
The statistics just lay it bare. Nearly 2/3 of Americans don't have a 4-year college degree. That's the working majority.
But the governing class is the opposite.
Completely. 95% of Congress members have a 4-year degree. Many have advanced degrees. Just a generation ago, about 15% of the House didn't have a college degree. That kind of representation has just collapsed.
So our representative government barely represents the actual lives of most of its citizens.
The working class is virtually absent from government. About half the U.S. labor force is in working-class jobs, manual labor, service, clerical work, but fewer than 2% of Congress members come from those backgrounds. This credentialist prejudice means the people making policy have no lived experience of the struggles most people face.
So the problem isn't just about the money. It's about this erosion of dignity. This is where we get to the idea of contributive justice.
Yes. The financialized economy and the rhetoric of merit have compounded the distress. By valorizing the credential on brains, the financial engineers, the consultants, the system implicitly suggests that the work done by the working class, the nurses, the mechanics, the delivery drivers, is a lesser contribution to the common good.
And the paychecks reflect that moral judgment.
They scream it. In the late 1970s, a CEO made about 30 times what an average worker made. By 2014, that was 300 times more. The system doesn't just pay them less, it tells them their effort is less valuable. And that injury to your dignity, to your status, is arguably just as corrosive as the stagnant wages.
So we need to shift the whole conversation from how we divide the money to how we affirm the worth of everyone's contribution.
That's the pivot to contributive justice. It shifts the debate from distributive justice, how to divide the pie, to how we can affirm the dignity of all kinds of work. The goal is to create a society where everyone can contribute meaningfully and, crucially, win social recognition for doing it.
It sounds less about equal outcomes and more about equal respect.
It's about restructuring the economy of esteem. And you can do this through policy. Economic policies are never just about balancing budgets. They're model statements about whose work we value.
So what are some concrete examples of policies that would express that kind of moral judgment?
Well, you could look at raising taxes on financial transactions on high-frequency stock trading instead of having high taxes on payrolls. Or you could adopt a federal wage subsidy to make sure that even low-paid work can support a family, affirming that their labor is essential.
Or just reversing the capital gains preference we talked about at the start?
Exactly. Taxing a nurse's income at a higher rate than a passive investor's income is a moral judgment. It says society values speculation over productive labor.
And reversing that expresses the opposite moral judgment.
It says productive labor is more valuable than casino-like speculation. The key is we have to start contending with the moral questions that are buried inside our economic arrangements. Only about 15% of financial flows today actually go into new, productive businesses. The rest is just speculation on existing assets. Taxing that speculation is a direct way to honor production.
And in doing that, you start to repair the moral fabric that was torn when my neighbor's factory was gutted. Not because it was unproductive, but because the tax code valued speculating on land more than it valued making things.
That is the critical link. We have to acknowledge that the policy choices that favored the financial sector were not accidents. They were moral choices that fundamentally devalued the dignity of the working class.
This deep dive has really shown us the debris field left behind by that promise of market liberation. The path from the 70s to today is a clear one. A promise of freedom led to a financialized economy built on asset inflation and debt. And that created massive gains for a few, it eroded the dignity of work for the many, and it accelerated this cultural drift towards isolation, dependence, and narcissism.
And that combination of market-driven globalization and meritocratic ideology has just systematically unraveled the moral ties that bind us as citizens. Globalization encouraged the successful elites to develop these cosmopolitan identities, making them less reliant on, and frankly less grateful for, the contributions of their fellow citizens, the people who build the roads and staff the hospitals. At the same time, the doctrine of meritocracy taught the successful that their achievements were purely their own doing.
We replaced civic solidarity with this hyper-individual competitive achievement.
And renewing civic life depends on repairing those social bonds. We have to move away from this destructive idea that success is just a personal reward for talent and effort. We need to restore a sense of belonging to a community to which we are all, in the end, mutually indebted. We have to reestablish a moral framework that honors the essential contribution of everyone who participates in the common good.